Prosperity in Black America. What will this require? Is Black business prospering? Are we reaching women and minority-owned businesses? How do we achieve earning parity for wealth for our families? Do our children really have access to education? Will our families have choices for our children? Prison pipelines, mass incarceration, tearing our families apart. A healthcare system not accessible to the masses. The disproportionate termination of Black women from corporate America. When will we actually begin to address what's really at play? How do Black people gain more power to help make these changes? This requires a lot of political will and courage. I'm that provocateur of change. I am Cindi Bright. Welcome to Heartbeat. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Heartbeat. I am your host, Cindi Bright. Thank you for joining us this evening as we are going to have another great conversation this evening. When we talk about prosperity in Black America, there are so many systems at play that we need to tackle and deal with. And talking about these issues and keeping these issues in the forefront, particularly for elected officials and for people to hear, and for us who have voting rights and voting power, we need to pay attention to these topics and to these issues. Today's show is about bail, ransom, wealth transfer, and real community safety. So I asked the question, have we really solved public safety issues with the systems that we have in place now? And the systems that we have in place now are around criminalizing poverty, poor people. Joining us this evening to have this discussion is an attorney located here in the Seattle area who is on the forefront of working in these court systems. She has written an article recently about the impact that this system is having here in the Seattle area. It is a national conversation happening across the country now. I want to welcome in Sade Smith. Welcome, Sade, into Heartbeat this evening.
Hi, Cindi. Thanks for having me.
Hi there, Sade. How are you? It's been a long time since I've seen you.
I know it has been a long time. I'm all right. How are you?
I'm good. Are you doing good?
Yeah, I am.
You're still in the battle, I see.
You know, it doesn't end. It doesn't end.
It doesn't end. Look, I read the article that you wrote. I want to show our audience this article that you published in the South Seattle Emerald, and you wrote a very powerful, provocative article about what the bail system, how it's working, what's happening here in King County particularly. And there's a lot of issues in here that you raise, and I want to give you an opportunity to unpack. So I just kind of want to turn this over to you to just kind of give us an overview, both of the issue that you wrote about, the issue that you're on the front line fighting about. Talk to our community about this bail issue and how this is perpetuating here in King County in the Seattle area.
Yeah. So I'll talk specifically about the King County, the felony court system, which is the state courts. There's one in Seattle and there's also one in Kent. What is happening and what is happening on the misdemeanor level as well is that our community members are being, a large bail is being imposed on them. And statistics show that, Black people held in the King County jails receive 40% higher bail than white people, or 40% higher bail than everybody else. And white people receive 25% less. And so we're seeing this disparity from the beginning. And that disparity also manifests in charging disparities, right? So police make reports. They pick and choose what facts they want to add in or allegations they want to add in. A lot of the times they're completely untrue. And then prosecutors decide based on those statements from police what they're going to charge. And what we see again and again is that people who look like us are charged. The charges that we receive are just substantially higher and more substantial than the charges that white individuals receive. And so when the court gets the case, you go, a community member will go before the court and the court will read the probable cause certification. The probable cause certification is what the police officer wrote. And then, of course, the charges that the prosecutor brings. The court makes the determination based on the statements that the police wrote and the charges that the prosecutors brought. And that's where you see a huge situation where our community members are being held on hundreds of thousands of dollars of bail. But even if it was, $50,000 bail, how many people in our community could even turn over 10% of that, $5,000? Not that many people in the Seattle area, not that many people nationally have $5,000 to hand over. In the bail system, what happens, there's a Washington state court rule, or what's legislated is essentially that the bail companies will put forth all of the bail to the courts, but the individual has to pay the bail organization or the bail company 10 to 15%. In Washington, it's 10%. And what happens is that you never get that 10% back. And then you have to put down collateral. So if there's some reason why you can't appear in court, sickness, or you can't get transportation because we don't have a substantial public transportation system, then you lose that 10%, but you also lose the collateral you put down. So essentially, the courts are allowing the bail companies to extract resources from community that community just simply doesn't have. And in exchange for that, if you can't post the bail, if you don't have the resources, you're stuck in jail. And who's more likely to not have the resources in the United States? That's based on a genocidal slave society, a capitalist society where we have just been completely extracted from our entirety of our existence here. And so our community members are languishing away in these jails. And what's happening is the King County Jail in Seattle has a national suicide rate that's 8 times the national average. We just had a horrific situation at the King County Jail where Mr. Michael Rowland, I would say, was murdered. He was pinned down in the prone position, just like Mr. George Floyd was, and he was alive when he went into the King County Jail, and he passed away inside of the King County Jail. And so what the court is essentially saying by imposing this bail, what the cops are writing in affidavits, what the prosecutors are charging, is saying that if you don't have the money, then your life is at risk. And so I hope that is a good summary of what's going on. But it's egregious what's happening to our community members, the theft of resources from family members, the loss of collateral, just an ongoing issue, and the health disparities that happen in the King County Jail. There was an audit in 2021, which is what I pulled some of the statistics from in the article. But in 2021, King County's own audit, and it's on the King County website, determined that, hey, like, we have race disparities, but it's not just in how much the bail is imposed. It is in what kind of sanctions, infractions are being had. Black people receive higher sanctions and infractions. We get infracted more, we get in trouble, we get harsher penalties. On top of that, our health disparities are worse. And so because we're being locked in a cage, obviously we're social creatures, we should not be in cages. Because we are experiencing that, we are coming out with our bodies destroyed, our minds destroyed. And so that's generally some of the issues that are going on with bail.
Did you happen to catch, there was an article written a few days ago. I did not bring it to highlight tonight. I actually read it this afternoon. It was in Newsweek, and it was about a man who was incarcerated, who was having a mental health crisis. This is in Arkansas, but they referenced that there is a Seattle attorney, and I actually thought about you when I read it, wondering if it was you that's the attorney involved in it. But it is so horrific what happened to him when he got incarcerated, and how he was thrown into a solitary confinement and basically left while the police officers or correction people, I don't quite know the job structure inside of these jails, but they were filing reports every single day saying that they did a cell check and the person was fine, when the person had actually died in the unit, and he was naked and crawled up. There was water sitting in the bottom of the... Do you know the story I'm talking about?
Yes, he died. He was completely emaciated. And I mean, U.S. jail systems, everywhere else in the world, they consider it torture. And so what's happening in our jails is egregious. But I did read the story in Newsweek, and it was horrifying.
It's horrifying. Would you say that the description in that article is comparable to what is happening here in King County?
I would say yes. So I want to also bring to light the harm that has been done to our trans community members. Oftentimes people who are trans are being locked in a King County jail and held in solitary confinement. And solitary confinement, again, is internationally recognized as torture. Other countries do not do this, especially other Western nations as well. Nobody incarcerates more people than the United States, right? We have 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prison population and jail populations. It's absolutely horrific. But the extreme disregard and the harm, I mean, Mr. Michael Rowland would still be alive today had he not been pinned down, had he not been abused. And so there is an ongoing issue. The Arkansas case is specifically egregious, but it's not so far out of the norm in the jails. I mean, the same thing's happening in New York. Seattle's made national news, of course. So yes, the situation is similar.
What's the plan, or what's going on with what has occurred since you've written this article? Is there any movement or action being taken by King County? We just swore in last week a new King County prosecutor, Lisa Mannion. Is she involved in this issue at all? And what's the plan of action here to start trying to address some of these issues?
I can't speak specifically about what Lisa Mannion is doing. I do know that when we're in court, prosecutors are still asking for egregious amounts of bail. So the prosecutor's office is extremely complicit in all the activity that's going on. There has not been a change. As far as community-wise, there is a movement organized around shut down King County Jail. Decrim Seattle's running that, as well as Lavender Rights Project and Dismantle. We're all organizing to try to bring more attention. And this issue, the courts know about it, right? It's not like this hasn't been brought to the court's attention. There is also an issue. The ACLU brought a suit called Hammer versus King County. And that was, I believe, in 1989. And that was a lawsuit about the conditions in the King County jail. And I believe that, one, it's ongoing. I know that they're still under the settlement agreement, but King County jail is not compliant with that settlement agreement. And so these issues aren't just, something that's happened in 2023. I mean, I'm 36 years old. This is almost going on 40 years, and this has been happening before, obviously, because, litigation takes a while. But the harm that's been done is ongoing and continuous. And just now, people are starting to learn about it.
What type of issues are Black people being arrested for that is putting them in this position?
Oh, everything. I mean, yeah, it's, so over the summer of 2020, we were working on a protest campaign, and it wasn't just Black people. I want to be clear. This criminal legal system preys on everybody. The most egregious disparities happen to Black people, right? And Indigenous people as well. So there should be a solidarity across the board. What's happening is a lot of violence in the King County jails. But when the protests were going on, SPD was just broadly sweeping, infringing on people's First Amendment rights. And there are federal court cases going on right now. There's federal litigation regarding SPD's activity, and there has been since the 2020 protests. But their violence, they were just dragging people, throwing them in the King County jail. And they were just being held and being harmed in the meantime. I mean, there's so many people. And so people just got swept up for protesting, right? Like something that is not in, the Seventh Amendment or something like that, literally in the First Amendment, your right to do so. And so there's just been a complete disregard. So what happens is there's a lot of, preaching about, oh, this is how you act around police, but there is no way for us to be safe, right? I mean, whether we're smoking cigarettes or whether we're sitting in our homes, we've seen all of people like us get harmed by police in so many different ways.
There's a lot of narrative, in the paper today. There's an article that came out about Nike pulling out of downtown Seattle. There's a lot of commentary about the fact that Seattle has not recovered at all post-COVID. It's laced with drugs and just a lot of bad activity in Seattle. And so there's this notion that, well, let me just ask you this. Given that we are still here in the Seattle community, still not even, I don't know what the data is, 10% recovered post-COVID, and it seems like the crime is increasing here. What are your thoughts about what are public safety officials, what do we do to try to help deal with this issue of the mass incarceration, but at the same time, the growing drugs and violence and businesses leaving the Seattle? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So a lot of times, businesses and community is, juxtaposed against people who are getting charged and incarcerated. And the reality is that we're all on the same side, right? And so what happens is in Seattle and King County spends $200 a day jailing people in the King County jail. That's $73,000 a year. That is not going to mental health care. That's not going to addiction therapy or any type of rehab. So what we're doing is we're literally burning money, caging people, traumatizing them, and then putting them back on the street and wondering why they can't get it together, right? So we have people without housing. We have a huge housing disparity here. And so when you don't have housing, you're getting priced out of where you grew up. People used to self-medicate. So I believe the statistics starts like 64% of jails, 50 or so percent of state prisons, and 45% of federal prisons, those are people with serious mental health crises. And so what are we doing? In other places around the world, they invest in people's public services, resources for people so that they can get the care that they need. If you gave any individual going through the criminal legal system $200 a day, we would never see them again. But we're unwilling to do that. We're unwilling to care for people. What we're willing to do is throw them away. And so we would save so much money. If you want to put it in a capitalist perspective about money, we would save so much money just investing in people as opposed to throwing people away. For example, it's been calculated that $1.2 trillion a year is gone into the criminal legal system nationally, and that's dealing with all the collateral consequences. Mind you, free college for all was only $58 billion a year, right? So we're talking about 1.2 trillion compared to 58 billion. Then you have student debt is 1.6 trillion. And so this is annually how much money we are throwing into caging and traumatizing people. And so they made the criminal legal system, they made it a business, right? So in the King County Jail, what happens is a lot of the work that's done in the King County jails, it runs on slave labor. Our people are incarcerated and they're trustees in the jail. They run the kitchen, they distribute all the resources for people who are also incarcerated. And so what it's doing is taking people, stealing their labor, and then, demonizing them. They don't pay them a fair wage, nothing. And then they put them back out with no resources. Again, if that money and those investments had gone into community members, we would never see them again. And our concern was crime. But I also want to note that since 1991, crime has dropped 50% in the United States. But in Washington state, and this is consistent nationally, since 1983, I believe, yes, to 2018, the state prison population went up 182%. From 1970 to 2015, the jail population in King County, so the jails, which is what happens when people are held locally, went up 362%. So despite the fact that crime has been declining, and it was declining before they started doing increase in jails, by the way. It was declining way before that. So it wasn't caused by that. They're still incarcerating more people. So it has nothing to do with the crime levels, has nothing to do with keeping you safe. It doesn't keep you safe. Jail actually harms you because when people are released, they're so destabilized. What studies have shown is that when people are let out on bail early or when they're giving housing first, they do not reoffend. And so that's what we should really be concerned about.
Should not go unsaid that in many of these situations, in the situation I referenced back in Arkansas, the bail set for him was $1,000, which means that he needed $100 to get out of prison, and he didn't have $100. And while some people might, not understand that, I think that highlights the magnitude of a lot of these issues around poverty and what is actually happening to people. When people hear me talk, my activism is heavily around earning parity. I don't know if you heard the show last week where we had several Black men on who have these we talked about mental health and the suffering in silence. But Black men are being put out into labor positions. They're being paid blue collar wages. And I continue to say there's nothing wrong with getting your hands dirty, but we live in a city that it requires at least $44 an hour to pay rent around here. And so when you think about the man in Arkansas who didn't have $100 and his family could not get answers, could not understand what was happening with him, and the people that our tax dollars are paying to protect us are filling out their forms every night and saying that he's okay and everything's okay and they've done checks, but in fact he's laying dead in the cell. I actually saw some of the pictures, and to our viewers who followed the show, if you don't understand just how egregious this issue is, and to Sade's point about, this is about profiting off of poor people that is having a disproportionate impact on Black people and Black people's lives, and the generational trauma and the lineage that continues to carry that burden generation after generation. And so just kind of in our last couple minutes before we go to break, Sade, what do you want to see happen? What do you want to see happen in this circumstance, in these circumstances?
Yeah. We've had, over 100 years of seeing how jails and prisons work in this country. And we've had tons of movements regarding reform. I believe one of the biggest reform movements was the Wickersham Commission. I believe that was 1929, where it was recognized that policing was terrible and that we have issues with jail. And we keep doing this thing where we keep allowing the prison and the criminal legal system to slightly morph itself. But statistic after statistic shows that we're still dying. And so I would like people and would love people to realize that there's no version of this where we are safe, where we are free, where we are liberated, and where we're cared for. The only thing that we need to do is abolish the King County Jail. We need to abolish jails nationally. And we need to talk about abolishing the state prison systems. We need to recognize that we're getting goods every single day. They're being processed by slave labor. It's across the board. It's an exception within the 13th Amendment. So we just need to stop this. There's just no way that there's no employing better people, no amount of training. There's nothing in this capitalist violent system that is going to keep us safe except abolition and community care.
How do we do that? What's the steps to take to abolish the prisons?
Yeah. So what the state and what the local municipalities need to do is they need to stop funding them, right? And they need to talk about putting money into our schools, right? Washington State, I believe they spend about $11,000 a year per student, but they'll spend over $200,000 a year sending a student or a child to Green Hill, right? Which is a juvenile detention facility. And so that's such an insane disparity. It's like, how are we even talking about educating people or caring for people when we're spending pennies on the dollar when it comes to actually sending them an education and providing for them for the future? And so, stop spending money. It's just the state needs to stop spending money on it. It needs to stop spending money on policing. They're not keeping us safe. We keep us safe, right? Police respond after the fact. Jails aren't keeping us safe. People need resources. And I say this, the ACLU did a study that I thought was really powerful. Every one of my clients, I was a public defender for 7 years. I've been practicing for 10 years, 11 years. And it's very clear that our clients have been in horrible situations. And Marion Papa said the best. She said, you were not introduced to violence by committing it first, right? It happens to you. And then there's a continuation and a cycle that goes on. So if we give people the care they need when they need it, we don't have these issues. We don't have these public safety concerns.
Do we have any elected officials who have put any bills forward to do this?
That is what I don't know. And I doubt it for as far as complete abolition. That's, people think you're kind of crazy for that. But I mean, we've seen all the ugly iterations of the criminal legal system and nothing's helping. So I think that's the only natural fruition. But I haven't seen any legislators talk about shutting down the jails yet.
All right. Well, this information is certainly helpful. This is why we do the show, is to have these conversations and get this information out to our communities and out to our elected officials so we know what we want from our elected officials to help us deal with these issues. Sade, I want to thank you for coming on today and keeping the community informed. We will be back in touch with you at some point this year so that we can try to get some updates, and particularly when we get into election season and we start talking what some of our candidates running for office and our elected officials. We're going to take a quick commercial break and we'll be right back.
Thank you.
Half that up in sacks. I favor black businesses. Assuming I'm rooting for everybody that's black.
Pacific Northwest Ballet unveils Giselle, ballet's classic tale of romance, betrayal, and immortal love. The New York Times calls it a triumph, comparable to an epic film. This stunning production is touched by magic. Order tickets now at pnb.org.
Hey guys, Besa Gordon here, and before heading to Belize, Trey Holiday and I had to make sure we linked up with our good friends over at Market Street Shoes to, of course, grab a few things for the trip. From bags to socks, shoes, sunglasses, earrings, and more. Before going on any trip, make sure you stop at Market Street Shoes. Trust me, you'll find just what you need to make your trip not only enjoyable, but fashionable.
Welcome back to Heartbeat. I am your host, Cindi Bright. This evening, we're having a conversation with attorney Sade Smith to talk with us and our community about bail and abolishment of the jail system. Let me bring in Heartbeat regular commentators that are joining us this evening to talk more about this topic after hearing Sade. Let's welcome in Joy Stanford, Stefani Coverson, and Karen Fleshman with me this evening. Good evening, ladies.
Hello.
Hi.
Whew, what'd you think about what you heard Sade talking about?
Well, I'd like to say everything she was talking about happening in Seattle is happening in San Francisco too. You know, we have the highest concentration of billionaires of any city on the planet, and we have 5,000 homeless people who are disproportionately Black, like upwards of 40% of them are Black in a city where Black people make up 6% of the population. And we had elected a progressive district attorney who ended cash bail and instituted other changes, and they recalled him. And now a wonderful, wonderful Black woman has been elected district attorney in Alameda County. And literally, she was just inaugurated, and they're already talking about recalling her. So there is, anytime you try to disrupt the system or change it in any way, in the many ways that Sade described it needs to be changed, the pushback is vicious and intense.
Mm. And the pushback on this is because there's so much profit for these folks involved in keeping Black people locked up. When we heard, last week, the men that were talking about, their workplaces and the stress and trauma that they're dealing with, and you look at what she just talked about today, I mean, there is such a direct correlation to this trauma-filled society of targeting Black people to, there's just so much to say about it. I had such an emotional week after last week's show, just even unpacking what a lot of those men said. And then today, did you guys also read the article that I referred to in Newsweek where the man in Arkansas and how egregious things were back there?
But I found it interesting in Sade's article that, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4 different agencies within King County share 5.5% of their budget, right, of the general fund budget, but 71.5% of that budget is spent on the criminal legal system. That is egregious in itself. So if you put that $200 a day that we're spending on a prisoner, and we educated folks or gave them some sort of schooling, or not even schooling, it could be tradesmen, paying for them to be electricians or plumbers or linemen, doing something where they can earn a good, a living wage. Because what did you say, Cindy? $44 an hour to live in Seattle. So you have to earn a good wage. So if we took that money and we spent it in a different way on community resources, which I believe we both ran on when we were running for office, we wanted to spend resources. We didn't say we wanted to not have the police, but can we shift some of those resources to community resources so that people have an opportunity and more access to housing, to jobs, and other resources like that.
One of the things that if you caught her comments about, the investment into our children too, Stefani, you've worked in the Seattle public school system. Those school systems is where this all begins. Talk to us about your own experiences in that school system and, connect that dot with what Sade was talking about how this all manifests itself.
It absolutely is a these systems are working as intended. And so my experience, in fact, is disproportionality in discipline of Black and Brown students, disproportionality of discipline or corrective action in Black and Brown teachers. And what we do know about education is that a representative staff of educators create better outcomes for youth, not just Black and Brown youth, but
youth.
all youth,
Yeah.
period. And so, I think the idea of this school to prison pipeline, where youth are Black and Brown youth are more likely to have the police called on them, be suspended, sort of all of these pieces. And, these systems work all as intended. It sometimes is like we'll say a manufacturing line, right? That these pieces happen in the school system.
Yes.
And then, you are in disciplinary action, expulsion, sort of all of these different processes. And then you're in the juvenile criminal legal processing system. And then you're in the, adult criminal legal system. And I think it's also worth just noting that there's also a foster care to prison pipeline, right? So it's all of these systems, again, working as intended. And then to Sade's point, and Joy, I think you brought this up as well, like there is a financial incentive for incarceration. And I just want to flag for everyone, in August of last year, 2 former Pennsylvania judges were sentenced to prison for orchestrating a cash for kids scheme for-profit prisons in exchange for like almost $3 million worth of kickbacks for sentencing youth as young as 8 years old, many of whom, first offenses for things like jaywalking, petty theft, skipping school, smoking on school property. And so this bail system is just another part of sort of the cog in this machine to create disparate outcomes and disparities in sentencing and in jail times. And the last piece is these folks have not been proven guilty. And so they're sitting languishing in
Starving
jail,
to death, starving to death,
waiting for trial,
being traumatized.
and Black folks are significantly more likely than white folks to be falsely accused of crimes. And then, you're walking in your orange jail suit, right? And so that sends a message to the jury versus the people who can bail out and get their nice suit or nice dress or whatever it is that they're going to wear. And so it's disgusting.
I think a couple things that you just said, Stephanie, are worth really emphasizing. And, earlier today, I was talking to my son about a completely different topic, but he used this analogy of, I think he called it like a chicken look, where you're just constantly like looking over your head, that's the kind of society we as Black people live in. And I think that the general public may not completely understand just how the false accusations, like it only takes one person to say something far-fetched. We live in a Karen society, so it just takes one of them to say something false. and we end up in a prison cell. And to combat that is almost impossible. The other thing I think that what you were saying that I thought I just had a visual of it when you said it is this system is like an assembly line, and every single the school system, corporate America, when we talked about, last week we talked about the workplace is version 2.0 of the plantation. It's the exact same system at play. And I think a lot of people are just beginning to understand what we've all been screaming and talking about forever, because they've used every endpoint to push Black through that throughput and into a system that keeps us poor and keeps us incarcerated and keeps white men in power and taking all the money. And this is all about money at the end of the day. All of these systems is skewed to make sure that white men continue to have it all, or the 1% of white men, and the rest of the people can just suffer. And the lack of, who used the word empathy? The lack of even having empathy for another human life just doesn't seem to exist anymore.
It also keeps us quiet. So
That's what keeps us quiet?
It also keeps us quiet. So it dampens down what they consider rhetoric. And we're just stating facts. So we're just stating facts. Anybody who wants to say, and what comes to mind for me is AOC, that whole group of women in Congress that are like, what about this? What about this? What about this? That's what we're doing here. We're saying, what about, keeping poor people in jail? What about mass incarceration? What about our school system being a school to prison pipeline, our foster care system, same thing. I'm glad you had the opportunity to ask Sade, who do we have here in Washington, in Olympia, who is pushing through legislation to reform this? If they're doing it in Illinois, if they're doing it around the country in different states, why are we not doing it here in our own state?
Good point. Let me just quickly. I'm going to go to commercial break really quick, and then I'm going to pick back up on that point, Joy, because that's why I was asking her that question about, is there anybody who's actually carrying this? But let's take a quick break, and I'll be right back.
Half that up in sacks, I favor Black businesses. Assuming I'm rooting for everybody that's Black. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey guys, Besa Gordon here, and before heading to Belize, Trey Holiday and I had to make sure we linked up with our good friends over at Market Street Shoes to, of course, grab a few things for the trip. From bags to socks, shoes, sunglasses, earrings, and more. Before going on any trip, make sure you stop at Market Street Shoes. Trust me, you'll find just what you need to make your trip not only enjoyable, but fashionable.
Pacific Northwest Ballet unveils Giselle, ballet's classic tale of romance, betrayal, and immortal love. The New York Times calls it a triumph, comparable to an epic film. This stunning production is touched by magic. Order tickets now at pnb.org.
Welcome back to Heartbeat. I am your host, Cindi Bright. We are talking this evening about bail and about abolishing the jail system due to the egregiousness of what is happening in the jails and the criminalization of poor people. And Sade Smith was on with us in the first half, describing to us how this has escalated over the years in terms of the suicide rates that are happening inside the prisons. And kind of what I took away from it, and right before break, Joy was just starting to go down that path. There really doesn't seem to be focus on that from a legislative perspective about trying to help deal with, whether you call it bail reform, public safety reform, all of that. Joy, back to what you were saying about that, last year in session, I think here in Washington State, Karen, I'll be curious to hear if you have any intel in California, but we had an elected official, he was a first-time candidate in the 30th, Representative Jesse Johnson, put a bill forward about police reform. Now, Jesse is no longer an elected official. He lasted one term, which is 2 years. I don't know if there's a correlation between what he put forward and what he had to deal with just to get that passed. But there isn't a champion that that I can see for the work that Sade is talking about. Do any of you have any, do you know of any conversations happening with elected officials? Who should we start to talk to? I mean, we're here in the 37th district. I mean, who should we begin to tap on the shoulder and start trying to get some of this work done? And Karen, do you have any thoughts about that down in your area in San Francisco?
Sorry. Here in California, police officers associations and correctional officers associations, the unions that represent people who work in prisons, are allied in a very, very powerful statewide lobbying force. Imagine they're all paying dues. A couple $100 from every paycheck goes into the unions. And what these unions do, they donate to elected officials, they lobby elected officials, they can come after, like the Chesa Boudin recall here in San Francisco, led by the Police Officers Association. And they can really stymie any elected official who wants to take action. You add that up with all of the propaganda that we are fed constantly in the media, from highlighting crimes to all the police TV shows, all this narrative that we should be scared of criminals who are generally depicted as Black and brown men, and that cops are the good people who protect us. And so that narrative becomes very, very popular. And yeah, it's very, very difficult to go against police and go against prisons.
Mm-hmm. And the conversations that were held here in Washington State involved law enforcement. So the fact that they are now saying, "Oh, we can't, our hands are tied. We can't do this. We can't do that." We were at the table. You were at the table with our legislators, bringing these type of policies forward. Then come back to the table and tell us what you need from us. I'm like Karen was talking about, the pictures that I'm seeing are drug addicts. Mm-hmm. Pictures that I'm seeing on my social media in my community that I live in are people that are smoking fentanyl and are okay. How about we not post those pictures, and how about we put some resources to getting them help, having some addiction counseling, seeing what they need. What kind of stress are they under? We talked about that, like Cindi said last week. Men, not coming forward with the stress that happens in the workplace, the stress at home, the stress in just society. And I'm going to recategorize how you said it, Cindi. I always feel like my head is on a swivel.
On a what?
A swivel.
Oh.
So when I'm in certain spaces, I'm like, okay, where's the door and who's here? And so Black folks, we always have to have our head on a swivel because you just don't know what's going to pop off. So yeah, but that's the stuff that comes to mind for me. Why aren't we putting that money to resources for that, job creation, addiction counseling, all the things that keep people poor?
If I could just hop right in, I mean, I think to sum it up, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so this idea of reducing police budgets, for example, to provide support, mental health, and social work counselors or social workers when folks are in distress, folks are having mental health episodes, or wellness checks. We've had Black folks murdered over, a next door neighbor calling saying, oh, so and so, door is open, or I haven't heard from this person in a minute. You should check on them. And then in come the police, with guns drawn, etc. And there's no accountability for that. And also, I think there's no desire to divert. Well, there clearly is no desire because it hasn't happened, despite calls for it, diverting funds, because having, law enforcement show up on the scene for things that have nothing to do with their bailiwick, most times it all turns out bad.
The a point that you are all driving home in your own way is that we are not ever dealing with the root cause of any of these issues. And so if we go, there are a lot of symptoms of things like we don't have affordable housing, we don't have access to health care. Again, this is about our ability to have an earning power and wealth that has been stripped away. And when there's 10 cents gained, there's 20 cents removed. And this is the fight you see happening all over social medias right now, right? Anytime there's advocacy on behalf of Black people, the visceral reaction to that is to, but the situation, and criminalize who they are because they've made a choice how to cope with life. And it feels increasingly, it's increasing in terms of the intensity of it, because the disparities are so far and wide now that, again, this brings back the conversation about reparations in brown and Black communities, because to fix these issues, we have to start by repairing it, and repairing it requires trillions of dollars to do that, just to be able to get people land back, be able to get people to have money to get in down payments into homes, and to get, I'm done talking about giving Black people jobs. I'm using the language that for Black people to prosper requires way more than an entry-level job with benefits that you can't even afford to buy a home in this area with. And so what are your thoughts about some of these things I'm talking about? I mean, clearly wealth and earning power and reparations has to be at the top of the ticket in this next election. I don't know how. I guess it's Joe Biden running again. How is anybody going to run for public office without dealing with this particular issue?
The same way they always have. I mean, let's just start there. And so I think I find it interesting. It's suspicious that we continue to have the same conversations about the same issues. And even Dr. King brought this up in Where Do We Go From Here? Or no, it was in the letter from Birmingham jail, this idea of folks saying, like, I agree with your goal, but I don't like the way that you said it. Or this is not the right time to advocate for this or to push this forward. Wait your turn. And I think the missing piece is that folks are so laser sharp focus on this being a quote unquote giveaway to Black folks in terms of reparations. The point that racism, anti-Blackness, capitalism, ableism, targeting the poor, so the exploitation of folks who are lower income, all of this ugliness is interrelated. And folks are missing that. And also the propagandists are banking on us continuing to miss that.
Mm-hmm. Karen, what were you saying? I can hear you.
Oh, yeah. I last Thursday, I got to see parts of a new documentary about reparations, in particularly in Evanston, Illinois, which was the first community in America to pass reparations at the municipal level. And I was talking to the filmmakers afterwards, and I asked one of the filmmakers is a white man, and I asked him, how will white people benefit from reparations? And he talked about how we have real moral injury as white people for all the harm that we have inflicted. And that moral injury is what causes us to have all these pathologies, ranging from mass shootings, alcoholism, drug addiction. You know, white longevity in our country is actually going down, and it's going down because of overdoses and suicides. And he said that we will never really be whole. We will never really be free until we take accountability for the harm that we have caused and pay reparations.
Joy, were you going to add something to that?
I just think we've all said everything that wraps this all together, and it also shows all the intersectionalities of how this is connected. And I just, where can we all sign up to, advocate for this at the legislative level? What bill do we to sign in on, pro or con? Those are the things that I like to do to help reform this. But also, I mean, we had platforms, both you and I, Cindi, that included all of this. And so I find it interesting, just like our fellow commentators just said, I don't think anyone's going to run on that. And if they do, it's just not your turn. It's not the time. We're not going to push that. We keep hearing that. Then when is our turn? When is the time? Bernie Sanders has been pushing this for years, but no one's listening to him. They're like, no, we don't need you to run for president. No, we need you to be quiet. So it's like, when are we going to get this out there at the national level? And then it trickles down to us, not just statewide, but locally.
To repair, and the kind of money necessary to do that requires trade-offs. When you're, as a state or as a federal government, you have to make trade-offs. And the demographic of people in this country who have been accustomed to having it all have never been told no. And so to pivot to that, to move it to this, again, we've all heard, wait your turn. Joy, you and I heard it, running for office,
so much.
And that's over political power. And from my perspective, the quickest way to start getting this attention, to shift funding and resources to Black people across the country, is to get the right people elected into office.
Amen.
I mean, that's the only way we can do it. And the generation behind us, I mean, millennial, and they're not even really voting. And so,
this is true.
Right.
Well,
So
wait, they showed up. They showed
They
up.
did show
Them
up
and Gen
nationally.
Z. They did show up nationally. And though it's going to take a coalition, right? And so that's the problem. If particularly in the state of Washington, I think Black people make up 3 to 4% of the population. And given the propaganda around what reparations looks like, the misinformation, if we can categorize Social Security as a handout, Lord knows how, a system that we've paid into, if people are able to spin that successfully, like they are spinning the hell out of reparations as a handout. And so with that mis and disinformation,
Right.
and the fact that we're only 3 to 4% of the population here in the state of Washington, it's going to be a challenge to get a coalition, a multicultural,
Yes.
multi-generational coalition on board to push some of this legislation forward.
Yes. So, so the last data I saw about Black population here in Washington State was 6%. That was the last data that I saw. Not that that makes it a whole lot better for the point that you're raising, but it doesn't just have to be Black people that get the power to push these issues. It has to be courageous people that are willing to go in, and white folks who are willing to tell their cousins that, right? So I could make a strong argument. Karen, I think, would agree with this. It isn't the Black people's issues to fix, it's white people's issue to fix.
Amen.
And so they hold the power disproportionately. And here in Washington State, blue is the predominant elected power. So, I know this is rhetorical because we're running at the hour here, but, should we think about a way, who takes the lead on going after maybe it's, look, we have an election coming up on January the 28th for the new chair of the Washington State Democrats. Chair Tina Pawlowski is finished she's not going to rerun again. Maybe that's the time. And the candidate that, one of the candidates running is a former Bernie Sanders campaign, former Barack Obama, of a generation. She's, I think, a millennial. Maybe we have some more hope by getting younger people. So focus on a generation as opposed to a race of people that are willing to go in and fight for and help get policies and legislation in place to get this introduced. I'm going to be inviting on here really soon. I'm going to put a note into her this week, our Black lobbyist, Paula Sardinas, to have her come on and give us an update here soon for legislative session to hear what's going on. She would be a great person that we should bring this issue up to ask her about, is anybody talking about this, kind of like what she's hearing, and maybe her firm is one that can help spearhead some of this work. Final thoughts before we're at the hour here, before we close out, from any of you?
I have a final thought on reparations.
Mm-hmm.
There are companies, corporations that still exist to this day that were funded by and benefited from the labor and purchases and sale of enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
And so we also need to hold those companies for account as well. And so again, I think this is all of these issues we talked tonight are systemic and interrelated.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Look, thank you all for coming on with me this half and unpacking this a little bit. Thank you to Sade Smith, who was on with us the first half of the show. Her work is tireless. We're so grateful that we have somebody who is out there actively working to help change these. Next week, we will have on the CEO of Tabor 100, Ollie Garrett's going to come on for the first part of the show. She wants to talk to our community about licenses that are coming available. I'll let her talk to the number and the processes that we need to follow as a huge opportunity for Black business, for cannabis licensing, and a way that we can start to get some equity, some social equity in terms of our ability to earn a strong living as well. So I ran a little bit over, but thank you all for joining us this evening. We will look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday. Have a good week.
That up in Saks, I favor Black businesses. Assuming I'm rooting for everybody that's Black. Yeah. Yeah.